So we live in a world shaped by migration. From the very earliest humans to the present, the very, very earliest humans, people have been on the move, seeking food and safety. Whether fleeing an increasingly glaciated world, persecution, famine, or simply better economic opportunities, for millennia, people have migrated from one place to another. Over the past 100 years, borders and walls have increasingly kept people in or out. But for the daring and the desperate, migration continues. More people are on the move than ever before. So what does faith have to do with the way we treat immigrants? Speaking as a Catholic Christian whose faith is rooted in the Jewish faith of our founder, I believe in a God who became physically present here in our world. That's a migration. As a poor child, threatened by existing powers. From his earliest days, Jesus was on the move, crossing borders to escape Herod's jealous violence. In his ministry, he became a vagabond, Matthew says, with no place to lay his head. As a Jewish man, Jesus came from a nomadic people who moved around the Middle East, even after Father Abraham settled in the land of Canaan. Famine drove the Jews to the abundance of Egypt. Many years later, slavery drove them out to the desert to follow Moses to the Promised Land. The memory of displacement shaped Jewish law and tradition. This is from the book of Leviticus, but it's echoed many times throughout the Old Testament by the prophets. When the alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Clearly, God's people needed recurring nudges to remind them of their own persecuted history. So as Catholic Americans, most of our European ancestors came to this country when the only immigration laws reflected a racial bias against Asians. They were the only ones excluded. Not until the early 1920s were the first immigration laws established, setting quotas for who might come here. So I'm assuming, like most of the people in this room, my ancestors certainly came when you came. You just came. That's what you did. The boat got here and you got off. You came. Our Catholic ancestors came in waves in the 18th and 19th centuries because they were hungry or frightened or simply ambitious. And whether German, Irish, Italian, or Eastern European, they were welcomed for their willingness to work at low-wage jobs, but despised for their strange languages, customs, and religion. Sound familiar? We might need nudged. The current demonization of immigrants ignores the history lessons we should have learned when boatloads of Jewish children and adults fleeing Nazi Germany were turned away from our ports. It ignores the lengthy tradition of movement back and forth across our southern border and the deep family and community bonds throughout that region. It ignores our nation's dependence and exploitation of the lives and the labor of those who harvest our crops, clean our hotel rooms, and work in other low-wage jobs. Even as fences and walls have grown, the reality is that northbound people know that the border represents two signs: a clear keep out and an equally understood help wanted. If you can avoid arrest at the border, survive the trek through the mountains and the desert, we have jobs here waiting for you. Although we were shocked by the recent treatment of families at our southern border, current policies have grown out of a trend towards militarization and criminalization that began under President Reagan when the Immigration Reform and Control Act made hiring undocumented workers illegal for the first time, and strengthened border enforcement even as it legalized naturalize many who were already here. Under President Clinton, the passage of NAFTA flooded Mexican corn markets, forcing many small farmers to travel north across the difficult but still porous border to work on our farms. The terrorist attacks in 2001 resulted in greater restrictions on immigration, as well as an increasingly militarized border. As crossing the border became much more expensive and dangerous, more people stayed on our side rather than returning home to be with families in the winter, so they wouldn't have to risk multiple crossings. Deaths in the Arizona and Texas deserts began to rise as people were funneled away from cities and into the rugged countryside, reaching a peak of 492 a year in 2005. It's down in the 300s now, but only because immigration crossing that border is greatly reduced from what it was then. The ratio is actually much higher of people crossing. Immigration offenses that were once civil crimes are now misdemeanors and felonies. Our country is directing an inordinate amount of our resources toward the southern border. Half of all federally prosecuted crimes are immigration related, as more people are prosecuted and jailed. Every president, from Reagan to the present, has supported this trend. The difference with the current administration is the lack of discrimination and compassion in who is being deported, with no allowances made for family and community ties or length of residency. Border enforcement without attention to solving the issues that force people to move only guarantees that the problem will not go away. Unless we address the growing disastrous impacts of climate change, seek to build the economies of the sending countries, and work towards peace in areas of conflict, millions more will be displaced. What does our church have to say? Human dignity makes no distinction among people. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. We are called to see not an impossible problem, but an opportunity to encounter Jesus with every immigrant who knocks at our door. Pope Francis and bishops throughout the world, including our own U.S. Bishops' Conference, remind us of this repeatedly. 3 recurrent principles in Catholic social teaching. First, people have the right to migrate to sustain their lives and the lives of their families. Every person has an equal right to receive from the earth what is necessary for life, food, clothing, shelter. Before God, all are equal. The earth was given by God to all. When a person cannot achieve a meaningful life in his or her own land, that person has the right to move. Secondly, a country has the right to regulate its borders and to control immigration. No country is bound to accept all those who wish to settle here. The third principle brings the first two together. A country must regulate its borders with justice and mercy. A nation may not simply decide that it wants to provide for its own people and no others. A sincere commitment to the needs of all must prevail. Moreover, immigration policy ought to take into account other important values, such as the right of families to live together. A merciful immigration policy will not force married couples or children to live separated from their families for long periods. So Pope Francis, almost 2 years ago, called us to be the name of our gathering here today, sharing the journey. He called us to share the journey with immigrants. And he suggested some ways that we might want to do that. I know many of my St. Joe's co-workers have been sharing the journey at Mary's Place, and we'll hear more about that. But he also brought us, so we're going to give you some ways you can share the journey at the end, but I think that's important that we do that. But I also want to leave you with 4 pillars that Pope Francis called us to in his last World Day of Migrants message. So knowing that the world must work together to solve the desperate migrations, he calls on all nations to welcome, one verb, welcome, to promote, protect, and integrate. All four verbs require that we see and identify with the humanity of migrant people. Welcoming requires that more countries open their arms to more refugees. Protecting recognizes the special vulnerability of desperately poor people who are fleeing difficult circumstances and calls for special protections, never detention for young people. Promoting requires respect for religious beliefs, aid in finding work, education, and basic benefits, and promoting family unity. Integrating does not mean assimilation, rather an appreciation for the cultural gifts that immigrants bring as we help them become a part of our communities. So welcome, promote, protect, integrate.
Hi there. My name is Jim Morris. I'm a Vice President at Catholic Family Center. As Marv said, I've been in refugee resettlement at Catholic Family Center for most of my career. There about 20 years doing refugee resettlement work and immigration work. So Marv asked me to come up here and talk a little bit about the different classifications and categories of aliens because it's a confusing world, it's complex, and we want to make sure that we're getting all of our terms and categories straight. So I'm going to kick that off for about 15 minutes. I don't think I have time for questions here, but I'll be here for the 2 hours, and I'll be running a table with Maya from Catholic Family Center to talk about opportunities at CFC. So you could always come in and ask questions, follow up to this presentation. I'll send this to Marv if anybody's interested in having the PowerPoint presentation itself. All right, so we're jumping off. We gotta get. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the most simplistic way of breaking down alien resident categories. You've got undocumented, you've got non-immigrants and immigrants. So, the undocumented. Let's talk a little bit on undocumented immigrant or undocumented aliens, often called illegal aliens, and these are the folks that get most of the press these days. So these are folks that basically they don't have government permission to be in the United States. So this includes folks that enter without inspection, also known as IWI. And this is crossing the border without seeing a Department of Homeland Security agent on your way through. It includes visa overstays. So this group also includes students that overstay their visas, visitors that overstay their visas. This is going to include all those folks that have temporary protected status that cannot be turned back home, and they will also enter into this category. It includes trafficked people that are trafficked into the U.S., children, people that are trafficked into the sex trade. And of course the dreamers. We've all heard about the dreamers. So the dreamers were children when they first came in, young children, brought by their parents. And they're older now, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the protections they're offered at this point. So undocumented aliens, they're subject to deportation. That's the big thing, right? They're always under the threat of deportation. They're living in the shadows. If they're picked up by ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement folks, arm of the Department of Homeland Security, they'll be put into removal proceedings and likely deported. There's no, they do not get public benefits, and this is a big myth around undocumented aliens, that they're soaking up all these public benefits. I was just listening on the radio on the way here, report on NPR, and they were interviewing a woman, and she was making that point. And I was thinking, what sort of benefits do they get? If you've ever taken an undocumented alien to the county to apply for Medicaid, you don't get it, nor food stamps or cash assistance. So let's be clear about that. They're not work authorized. Most of them work, but they're not working legally. They're not. They don't have permission from the government to work in the United States. So we've all heard of DACA too. DACA is Deferred Action for Children Arrivals. And DACA was an executive order that the Obama administration enacted. They didn't enact it because that would have been legal, or not legal, but a law. So the executive order gave protection to the dreamers so that they could work legally. So they would have work authorization, they could come in out of the shadows, and they would be shielded from deportation. Seemed to make sense. They came here as very young children, they had lives established here in the United States. Most had no context for their home countries or where they were born before they got here. So of course that has since been, the Trump administration has put a halt on that. Like most Trump administration directives, it's tied up in court. So we're waiting to see where that'll settle out. Oops, going the wrong way. There we go. Non-immigrants. So non-immigrants are people that have legally entered the United States, but for a temporary time, for a specific time period or a specific reason. So this category includes visitors. People get visitor visas usually for about 6 months. Students are allowed temporary immigrant status. And this includes all the temporary workers, and this is the subcategories of temporary workers. There's about 20 or so. This includes your agricultural workers, R1 religious workers. There's a whole host of those. So again, these are people that have temporary right to reside, and they may be work authorized. They may not be work authorized. They have to apply for work authorization in order to do that legally. Generally, no public benefits for this category either. Oh, getting going the wrong way. There we go. Immigrants. So, immigrants are different words for immigrants. Legal permanent residents. Whoops, stop doing that. There we go. Legal permanent residents, green card holders, LPRs. These are immigrants. And immigrants are people that have been admitted to the United States with the expectation that they're staying in the United States, that this is their new home. So they are work authorized. If they have a green card, they're work authorized. Some may access public benefits, but not all. We're going to talk about the different ways you gain that status in the next slide. But they all have a pathway to citizenship. Basically, if you are an LPR for 5 years, you have a green card for 5 years, you can apply for citizenship and become a U.S. citizen. Okay, so there's a lot of different immigrant subcategories. I'm going to talk about just a few of them here. Okay, so let's start with the biggest one. The biggest one is family-based sponsorships. So current U.S. law allows for LPRs and U.S. citizens to apply for their overseas relatives. This is called family-based sponsorship immigration. So if the application is successful, those persons, those overseas relatives, can get a green card and also enter the United States. And in family-based, there's numerous subcategories. There are immediate family members, minor children, spouses, parents. There are another category for unmarried adult children, another category for brothers and sisters. And there's different, and they all have different preferences and priorities. So U.S. citizens have the highest priority for bringing in overseas relatives. LPRs have a lesser priority or are seen as a lesser priority, so their waiting times are usually longer. Depending on what category the person overseas is, that may take anywhere from a couple of years to a couple of decades to come in through family-based immigration. But this is about 65% of all the immigrants that are allowed visas each year. Okay, employer-based. So there's another category of immigrants. Another way to enter into the United States legally is for an employer to apply for an overseas alien to enter the United States, and they do that on the basis, they make a case that that particular person is the only person, or one of the few people that can do this job that they need doing here in the United States. And then we have DV, diversity visa lottery. So we've also heard a lot about this. A lot of people want to get rid of the DV lottery. What the DV lottery basically is, it's about 50,000 people being admitted under a special category that was formulated years ago that was trying to broaden the number of countries from which immigrants were coming into the United States. So the ones on the right, those are mostly humanitarian-based immigration. And we'll talk about refugees and asylees a little bit more in depth in a bit. But I just want to mention these other ones because they're folks that we work with a lot at Catholic Family Center. The special immigrant visa persons, these are persons from either Afghanistan or Iraq that have worked with the U.S. military or government overseas and are allowed entry into the United States because of that relationship and because they are fearing for their lives in their home communities. The Trump administration recently refused to reissue or reinstate or what's the right word? To continue that program, to give it the right funding so that it can move forward and continue to allow for those persons that are in danger overseas to come into the United States. When they do come into the United States, they're resettled as refugees, so they go through a refugee program. Same thing with many Cubans. A lot of the current U.S. law is that Cubans that are here in the United States for 1 year can apply for a green card. And I think this is the only nationality where that exists, but immigration law for Cubans is very distinct, very specific, has been since the days of Bay of Pigs. So that is still in the books. Even though wet foot, dry foot policy, which allowed for any Cubans that made it to land to stay here, that has since been ended. But still, Cuban Adjustment Act still exists. So any Cuban that's here and has been here for a year, they can apply for a green card. And then you have special immigrant juvenile status. So this is for kids, minor children, who are in the United States and have proven that they've been abandoned or abused by parents or guardians and therefore cannot return back to their home countries. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about refugees. So refugees, going back to the Refugee Act of 1980 was when the United States immigration law was amended to include or sort of formalize a special process for bringing in refugees. And refugees are persons that have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or membership in a particular group. Since the election, we've gone from a country that leads the world in refugee resettlement, that enjoys bipartisan support for refugee resettlement. And but since the election, now it's refugees that are themselves victims of torture and persecution are demonized as threats. We've divested as a country, the administration has directed that we scale back our commitments overseas to countries that are holding refugees or would-be refugees in asylum in their home countries. So the fact that we're not bringing in refugees anymore doesn't mean that there aren't refugees out there. There's 65 million displaced persons in the world. There's over 22 million refugees in the world. So they're not going anywhere. They are generally in poor situations in refugee camps in places like Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Jordan. All these poor countries around the world, they're hosting all these folks. Or if they're not in refugee camps, maybe they're living in the shadows in some other city overseas. A couple of points. This is sort of a long list. It's on 2 pages. So what the administration has done with refugees since they've come into office. They've imposed a refugee travel ban based on fabricated tales of insecurity in the existing system. They've banned certain nationalities from admission to the refugee program. They've ignored or willfully undermined or oversees State Department systems that interview refugees and put them in place to get resettled into the United States. Trump has filled critical federal refugee program posts with those who have an unfriendly or outright hostile stance toward refugees. He's lowered the refugee admission ceiling to the lowest level since 1980. We're on a pace to resettle only 20 to 25,000 refugees in this country. Right before Trump was elected, we resettled 1,000 in Rochester alone. And this, again, is in the face of the worst worldwide refugee crisis since World War II. And further, he's contemplating lowering that ceiling even more. So we went from a ceiling of 100,000 nationally to 45, and now he's floating 25. And even with the ceiling that he's enacted for this year, 45,000, we're only expecting about 20,000 in. So he's not even making good on promises to reach the ceiling. So this graph here shows a dramatic drop-off. I don't know if you can see this, but down here, this is October 2016, and this is April 2018. So, and this is nationally. So you can see, where refugee admissions have gone since the administration has come into office. Okay, on time? Okay. I just want to talk one other category: the separated children in the UACs, and what happened here. So this issue blew up last spring, the separated children, because of two sort of competing directives and U.S. law. So Trump's zero tolerance policy. What that said was basically that if you're crossing the border, we're going to prosecute you. We're going to detain you and prosecute you, and that's it. We're not going to let you release you to relatives while your court's pending. And in a lot of instances, they weren't given due process to file asylum claims. But this ran up against U.S. law, which says you can't detain children for more than 20 days. So the Trump solution to that was, we'll separate children from their parents. So parents were kept in detention, and children were sent to also detention centers, but friendly detention centers, if that can be said, where they were either kept in foster care settings or group homes or group detention centers. So that was about 2,500 kids. About 6 weeks later, they pulled back. It took them 6 weeks to figure out how monstrous that sort of action was. So far, they've reunited by court order 1,800 kids. There's still about 450 that have not been reunited, mostly because his parents have already been deported. So they have been ordered by the courts to reunify these children with their parents. They have not complied with the deadlines. They've had the audacity to ask the ACLU to do it for them. So there's still hundreds of kids where this is still an outstanding issue. I think I'm
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, cool. We've got time for TPS. Okay, temporary protected status. One more. So temporary protected status is it's legal status granted to individuals who are here in the U.S. From certain designated countries that are facing ongoing armed conflict, disaster, other emergencies. So say you're from Haiti, you come here for school, Haiti has an earthquake, you can't go back. The government decides Haitians are protected under TPS. So it's temporary status so you can remain in the United States until things sort out with your country. So the problem with this is that many times things don't sort out in your country. And the average stay for people with TPS is about 19 years. And of course, during that time, people's lives move forward, they have children, they get married, they establish lives. But one by one, the administration has been cutting off TPS, not renewing it. So it's hard to see the numbers. I'm sorry I couldn't make them bigger, but El Salvador is the biggest one. TPS is ending for Salvadorans. That's 260,000 people here in the United States that are going to lose status. Haiti is around 60,000. Honduras, 86,000. So all these folks are losing status as these programs are ended by the Trump administration. That is all the time I have. I've got Clinic Catholic Legal Immigration Network Incorporated is our national partner that has terrific resources on all sorts of things in regards to immigrants and ways to get involved as well. So you can look them up if you're interested in learning more. CIS has a website full of information too. That's the government website about applications and status and visa bulletins and whatnot. Catholic Family Center, we have an immigration program. We have walk-in hours for folks that want to get some advice in terms of legal issues. We run citizenship programs. We run programs to help people get green cards. We have partnerships with pro bono immigration attorneys, other folks, and that's our number. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Jim, for giving us an overview of very complex terrain and all that needs to be done to address that. So Father Jesus Flores is next, and he brought a couple of friends to, I think, to help him talk about some of the local realities to kind of shift gears.
I'm so pleased to see many faces that we have been meeting all over in the diocese. And I'm so pleased also to that Erica and Nancy, they were willing to come and to offer their testimony about the situation in our community. The challenges facing our area's migrant families are not new. In previous administration, there were also deportation that broke up their families. In the past administration, especially Mr. Obama administration, he didn't resolve most families' situation. There was at least some breathing room for a good number of them. For example, immigration agents had discretionary power to make a decision about deportation based on the case at hand. In various instances, they grant conditional freedom to people who had families with young children. In that way, a good number of our people in our communities, they secure work permits. So even though they were undocumented, they get the permission to work. And they get a social security number also. But in the present administration, that discretionary power has disappeared. Undocumented people who re-enter into this country has been made a serious felony, one that automatically leads to incarceration or deportation. The ICE agents pursue particular cases. Migrant people whose houses or homes, families and places of work, they already familiar with, so they know where do they live. Usually it is the male who is arrested and eventually deported after months of prison. Each family under such scrutiny constantly has to reevaluate the chances that they have to take a decision, to make a decision. If they decide to stay after the deportation of one of the parents, they face many challenges. And those challenges are those who Erica and Nancy are going to share with us. But if the family decide to leave after the deportation of one of the parents, they're going to face another challenges. In Mexico, they're going to confront, because most of them, at least those who are in our region, they came from very dangerous states in Mexico. Guerrero, Michoacán, Veracruz, they are treated by the cartels or over in Mexico. But also the people from Central America, if they decide to go back, one of the parents is deported, they're going to confront similar situation, maybe worse situation than those from Mexico. So I wanted to list just some of the ways that as a family is affected by the father or one of the parents' deportation. the mother has to assume the entire economic burden of the family on top of her normal family duties. Children have to assume responsibilities that do not correspond to their age. Going to work to supply missing income, as well as taking care of the younger siblings. The youngest children, not only they live in a situation of ever increasing anxiety and isolation, they exhibit behavioral change as a result of this situation, panic, depression, and many others. Among those kids who attend the school, their achievement declines markedly. The physical health of the entire family suffers. So